This is Get Real with Deb Waterbury, a show where Dr. Deb gets real as she teaches through books and studies on topics relevant for today. And now, here is your host, Dr. Deb Waterbury.
Welcome back to this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. We have been talking about the book of James, and it's, can be very difficult. James is one of those books that most people kind of get to and go, oh, do we have to? Sort of like Leviticus in the Old Testament. You don't really want to do James because he really does get all up in your grill and talks about all the things that you need to examine about your life. We're going to talk in the next couple of sections. We're going to talk about the tongue because and that's my least favorite chapter in the Bible because I have such issue with that. But he really does want us to, and again, I've said this over and over again, he doesn't want us to be offended. And the truth of the matter is, brothers and sisters, if what he says offends you, then you probably really need to look at it. What he really wants us to do is to look at ourselves in a manner in which we can then be confident that our salvation was true. Remember the fact that, and remember I've said this before, but James is writing his letter to a bunch of Christians dispersed. The letter begins with to the dispersion. And so he's literally writing this to Christians everywhere. He's sending it out to churches and he's saying, now just keep sending this out, because James is aware and has been hearing a whole lot of things about all these new churches and all these new Christians who are not necessarily behaving as if they're really Christians. And he's concerned. He's not wanting to judge them. That's not the point. James, out of love for them and their eternity, which is really the only thing that proves someone loves another person if you really and truly want their eternity set, his concern for their eternity is, did you really make a profession of faith in Jesus Christ, or did you just go through the motions and it not actually occur? Because there are demonstrative evidences within a life that has been changed by the love of Christ and one who has not. And so he wants you to be able to look at, he doesn't want us to be standing in front of Jesus on that great day and hear him say, depart from me, I did not know you. Of course, none of us want that. So it's really valuable to be able to spend some time looking at these areas. And so James really does just hit them one right after the other. Whether or not we're finding joy in our trials. How do we behave in the midst of those trials? Are we blaming God? How do we treat other people? Are we showing them partiality? What's going on in our hearts? Are we looking at the Bible and realizing and then letting it reflect us? And then do we walk away and act like we didn't hear it? He's hitting these things one after another. So in the section that we're talking about, and we talked about last week and this week, this one's called Faith and Works, and this one's kind of part 2 of that. Last week, I addressed first off that one verse, and this is one of the verses we'll look at today, verse 24 of chapter 2 in the book of James, where James says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. We talked about how that does not contradict what Paul says in Romans 3:28, that we are justified by faith apart from works. And so we talked about the reasoning, the different audiences. We talked about the different ways that the word justify is used. Paul uses it in terms of saying this is what makes you innocent, your justification once you've put your faith in Jesus. And James is using the word justify in terms of prove. Your faith is proven by your works, justified by your works. So they're homophones, two different uses of the word. So we talked about how they don't contradict each other, different audiences, different uses of the word. And as I said to you last time, I wanted to talk about in this section of verses 14 through 26 of chapter 2 of James, how James is talking here about 3 kinds of faith. He talks about 2 that are not good, and then he gives us examples of true faith. So last time we talked about claimed faith in verses 14 through 17. That's when a person just says they have faith, says they're a Christian, but you see absolutely nothing about a person with a heart change, with a person who's changed heart from Jesus by the way they treat other people. So that's what's claimed faith. So today I want to talk about 2 others. The first one is called solitary Orthodox faith, and the other one is true faith. So in the solitary Orthodox faith, I'm going to be reading verses 18 through 20 of chapter 2 of James. And he's continuing on with this thought process. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. So then James says, well, you show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one? Well, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? So these are strong verses. I mean, strong verses. And so what James is, and he would have totally shocked his audience at this time, because these are all, devout, many of them devout Jewish Christians that had been accepted Jesus as their Savior, but brought up Jewish. And he just started right there and threw a Jewish doctrine in their faces. From Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 19. One of those doctrines is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And so James hits this right off the bat. He goes, "You believe that? Good for you." Well, the demons believe that. This is the doctrine of the Trinity. It was considered holy to all believers, but in particular these Jewish believers who knew Deuteronomy and lived by that Torah. And James is like, "Yeah, you believe that? Good for you." The demons believe that too. So he really did start off with a kind of this, don't tell me what you believe and then not tell me what you're doing. You show me that faith apart from what you do, and I'm going to show you my faith by what I do. And then he goes on to say, good for you for believing that. This type of faith, many theologians call that kind of faith a solitary Orthodox faith. So Orthodox is a word that just means you're going by the rules, the law. Here it is. This is Orthodox. It has a set parameters for rules. And so what James is claiming here, rightfully so, is that this kind of faith that is just founded on these rules, and that this is what I know, this is what the Bible says, and this, he said, if that's where your faith begins and ends, then you are no better than the demons, because they believe, obviously, and they shudder. Now, I want to talk about that word shudder in here in a minute, but Ligon Duncan, I have to read this quote because I think it's so good. This is something he said on this subject. He said, "You can know some true things, and you can believe some true things, and you can even know and believe some important and true things. And you can even know and believe some important and true things about God and the Bible and salvation and still not be a Christian." Because there is a difference between knowing notions and knowing God. That is so strong. There's so much truth in there. Because you know what? I have talked to so many theologians who I doubt their salvation because they know so much. I mean, they could quote so much of this Bible, and yet I see not one evidence of a heart change. You can talk to an atheist, and they will know everything about this Bible and still not believe in God. You can talk to an agnostic. They'll know everything about God, know everything about this Bible, and not believe in anything. You can talk to so many people who don't say they believe in, they're just like, whatever, and they'll know a lot, but they don't know God. So I love that he says you can know a whole bunch of stuff, but if you just know things, you know notions. You know some notions about some stuff, but you don't know God. Because if you really know, that word know, biblical word know, is actually it's used in terms of sex and used in terms of intimate relationship in the Bible. And so basically and they use it in terms of sexual relationships because that's the most intimate way humans can know one another. The actual word know speaks of intimacy, a level of knowledge that goes beyond just surface. You know somebody, you know them intimately. So when he says if you know God intimately, then there's going to be a whole lot more than just some knowledge out there. So, and then I love the fact that when James says the demons know this and they shudder, that word shudder is not used anywhere else in the New Testament, and it's only used a couple of times in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And each time that word, which we translate as shudder, is used, it means this extreme emotional response to the knowledge of God. So, I really started thinking about that, and I started thinking that James says that it's good that you know this stuff, The demons know it and they shudder. So in other words, the demons know this and they have an extreme emotional response to the knowledge of God. What this tells me is that even those emotional responses that many people will have to God does not prove that they're saved. There's a whole lot of people out there who think because they felt happy, they felt joy, they felt all this emotion, they were crying in church, there's all kinds of tears happening, that emotion proves that it was real. And James is saying the demons do that. They have huge emotional responses to the knowledge of God. It has way more to do with, as a matter of fact, it has everything to do with how you behave. How is that manifested? Because then that shows that it's not just emotions, that it's your heart has been changed. And that really is the whole crux of the matter for James. And when you come right down to it, it's the crux of the matter for you and I as well. So then he moves on in verse 21. He starts talking about, because remember he asked that question to them. He said, do you want to be shown, you foolish person, what real true faith is, and that your faith is useless? So then he goes on and starts giving some examples of real faith. And he uses two people that we will be familiar with, Abraham and Rahab. So the verses on Abraham, verses 21 to 23, he says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see, that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. So I love that he uses Abraham, and he did it on purpose, obviously, because he's talking to a whole lot of Jewish Christians as well. Now, what we know is that it says that Abraham, the Bible in Genesis 15 tells us that Abraham was declared righteous because he believed God's promises that he would be the father of a huge nation and have and father of many nations. However, his faith was justified, and by that word justified I'm using was proven in Genesis chapter 22 when he was willing to sacrifice Isaac on the altar for God. So his faith was claimed, and it was said, and righteousness was imputed to him in Genesis 15 because he believed God's promise. But then in Genesis 22, he proved his belief and so what the Bible clearly says is that the justification of his faith became apparent in his actions, in his works. So it's not that Abraham added to his faith by what he did. It was that he proved that his faith was genuine by what he did. So that's why James uses Abraham as an example. And then I think that's the very same reason why he goes on to use Rahab. He goes on and says, you see that a person is justified by his works and not faith alone, verse 25. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? So Rahab, I think, is again, she didn't just say she believed. She put herself and her family in harm's way by hiding those spies and then making sure they were able to to escape whenever they were there in Jericho. So Rahab, again, proved by her actions what she said she believed. Now, I think it's interesting that James uses Abraham and Rahab. So he's using a Jewish patriarch and a Gentile prostitute as his two examples. And I think that he does that on purpose, because God is no respecter of persons, especially when it comes to faith. And not especially, he never is a respecter of persons, but in terms of faith particularly, James is saying Jewish patriarch had to prove his faith was true. Gentile prostitute had to prove her faith was true. This is true of all people. That we all, if we are truly saved, will demonstrate that in the way that we actually work and the things that we do. And then he moves on, ends it with giving an example of what dead faith is. And he does end with this negative example, and he kind of talks about dead faith being like, just death. He says, for as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. So this is really appropriate because faith is that's simply spoken of and not acted on is not really faith at all. It's dead. And so James literally says it's like a body that's dead if your faith doesn't have works. Now, I want to end this message with some encouragement, because I think that it might be easy to be discouraged, especially because, most of us look at our lives and we don't necessarily see a lot of good stuff. Even though you probably have, there are lots of good stuff, things in your life. I know I look in the mirror often and just think, are you joking right now? Why would you want her? Because I know I just sinned in my head 10 minutes ago. So it's difficult to look at ourselves sometimes and the sin that we have committed and the sins that we continue to commit, to think then that we're not going to hear on that day, depart, I didn't know you. What is it, that makes my faith real when I still sin? So, I think that I want to talk to you about this in terms of an analogy, because I think that if we can understand the truth of the course of our action, what sanctification actually is and what that means to us. So let's just say for argument's sake that I'm in Phoenix and I decide I'm going to walk to Flagstaff. So I'm walking to Flagstaff. That's a long walk, by the way. So let's say I'm going to walk to Flagstaff and I get about halfway there and I stop at a lemonade stand because there's one on the side of the road and I'm thirsty by now, and I stop for a while and I sip on some lemonade. Now, let's say somebody who knew I'd told a bunch of people, I'm walking from Phoenix to Flagstaff, pray for me, I'm going to get there. And so then let's say someone, drives by and they see me sitting by the road on the side of the road drinking some lemonade. Well, to that, they could think right then, well, she's not going to Flagstaff at all. She's just sitting, she got right there and she just wants to sip lemonade because she's sitting down. That's what she's doing. She didn't even go to Flagstaff. It could appear that I wasn't going there because I stopped to have lemonade. That's a trivial example, but this is how our lives are. You and I are here and we will live in eternity. We got a long way to go in this lifetime. Well, it's not really that long, but it seems long to us before we get there. Now, when you have a period of sin in your life, or any sin in your life, it could look to an outside viewer like you weren't going to heaven, that's not what your destination was. When the truth of the matter is you're just stopping there for a minute because you just lost your way, but you were gonna go on. So it goes right back to what Jesus said, that the Father promised that He would never lose any that was given to Him. It might look like you stopped. It might look like I stopped, but I didn't build a house at the lemonade stand. I was just stopping there. I was eventually going to go on to Flagstaff. You're eventually going to go on to heaven, even if you have that period of sin in your life, or a time of sin. I know about 15, 20 years ago, you would have looked at me and I know people would have said, that girl's not even saved. It's not that, I had a period of time a long period of time in my life where it would have appeared that my salvation had not been secured for me when I was 11 years old. The truth of the matter, I was always going to heaven. I was always going to be secured in my eternity. I stopped for a season of sin because I am a fallen creature, but I didn't build my house there. God knows that we're not going to build our house there. He knows where we're going. So understand that even if you have sinned, you do sin, whatever, there is what is it that John says in 1 John chapter 3, verse 9? He said, no one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's seed abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he has been born of God. So those who are truly saved may stop at the lemonade stand for a while, but you are going to move on because you will not make because God is that flesh man and that spirit man are going to do battle, but spirit man's going to win. Paul told the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, examine yourselves to see whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. And so basically he's telling you to test your faith. And that doesn't mean that you fail when you sin. It means, do you stay in sin? Has your heart not changed? Does your heart move always continually after God? I wanted to encourage, I think, because again, I feel like this can be a discouragement to those who have lived in sin, maybe are currently in a period of where you're fallen away. If you are truly God's, you won't build a house there. Now, if you're not, you will. And that's what James wants you to look at. Is your heart changed? I really encourage you, if you haven't already purchased the book, James on the Mount, it's I think I do a fairly good job of getting you through the book of James, especially this section in particular. You can get this book at debwaterbury.com, but by all means, make sure you read the book of James, and I would really suggest that you do some sort of study. This is important stuff. This is so very important that we understand what it is that makes us truly a Christian. James thought it was so important, he wrote an entire book about it. God thought it was so important, He put the book in His holy word. So it's something that's worth us taking notice of. But I do want you to be encouraged, because once that change has happened, it's not going to, even if you're in sin or had sin in your past, it's temporary, because you are going to be where you're going. And so we praise the Lord for that. I'm praying for you. I pray that this is helping you a little bit, maybe give you a little bit of encouragement even as you're being introspective. I'll be praying for you. Look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I hope you were blessed, and I hope you got some information that's going to help you get through your day. If you want any more information on any of my books or my articles or on any of my future speaking engagements, you can find all that information at debwaterbury.com. God bless you.